later. Okay, so this evening we're going to talk about abortion in Jewish tradition. Obviously, this has been in the news a lot in the last few weeks because of the new Texas abortion law. So I want to start out with a few general statements, and then we're going to look at what the Jewish tradition says about this topic. So the first, and probably one of the most important things to say about this is a complicated topic. It's a very emotional and it's a topic that really people have very deeply held beliefs and emotions and feelings about. And as a result of that, I believe, it's not easily reduced to a soundbite or a 280 character tweet. But unfortunately, public discourse these days seems to always rally around an epithet or a talking point that distorts their opponents. And so often this topic is reduced to a rallying cry of pro-life or pro-abortion. I don't know anybody who is anti-life. So the question is not really about being pro-life, it's about whose life, the mother's life or the fetus's life, and how do we balance the competing values involved in assessing each life or potential life. And I don't know anybody who is pro-abortion. The people who are opposed to the current legislation don't call themselves pro-abortion, they call themselves pro-choice, meaning that it should be the woman's choice to make, most often probably with perhaps in most cases the father or other family members, and of course her doctor or medical advisors, but primarily the woman's choice. In any case, each individual decision is often fraught with pain and anguish, and reducing the issue to a slogan, we ignore the complexity and the painful emotions that are experienced by the woman who is involved. Right? It's her life and her body and her future child. And it's often a very distressing and emotional decision for her to make. And sort of reducing it to slogans, and in my opinion, involving the state in this decision, unnecessarily causes extra anguish. So before I also talk about Jewish law, I want to talk about two other things. First of all, there was a famous movie that came out in 1988 that many people are still familiar with. It starred Jennifer Grey and Patrick Swayze. Yes, indeed, that is the movie Dirty Dancing. The story was supposed to take place in 1963, and therefore before Roe v. Wade had been decided. And a significant subplot in the movie was that one of the women dancers at the summer resort became pregnant and had an abortion. And because it was then illegal and therefore often dangerous, in her case, it was actually life-threatening. That was a subplot of that story. And the other case, which also happened in 1988, right? That story was supposed to take place in 1962 or 3. In 1988, the same year the movie came out, there was a real-life case of a Jewish woman named Nancy Klein, who was in a terrible car accident. She was 16 weeks pregnant at the time. And as a result of the accident, she was in a coma in a hospital. And the doctors informed her husband, that her chances of recovery would improve dramatically if they terminated the pregnancy. And the husband agreed. But before they could actually begin the termination of the pregnancy, two total strangers, unrelated to either the husband or the wife, two strangers who were opposed to all abortions, went to a judge that they knew would be favorable to their cause and actually got a temporary restraining order prohibiting the doctors from terminating the pregnancy. And this was after Roe v. Wade. The husband had a fight in court for 2 weeks to get the TRO dismissed, which of course he did, and it allowed the doctors to perform the abortion. In the end, Nancy did come out of her coma, but it was not a happily ever after story. There was damage to her brain, which affected her the rest of her life. It is possible that had the abortion been performed more timely, some of that damage may not have occurred. And because she and her husband were both Jewish, as we're going to see later this evening, had she asked her rabbi, he or she almost certainly would have urged the couple to have the abortion to save her life. So those are two stories I wanted to present at the beginning. And finally, before we look at the sources, the essence of this debate about whether you are in favor generally of allowing a woman to decide about a pregnancy or not, fundamentally turns on the question of when does a separate human life begin? So for many fundamentalist Christians, and traditionally also the Catholic Church, the answer of when a separate human life begins is at conception. I understand this as a potential religious belief. It's certainly one possibility. You can say that when you have a fertilized egg, you now have all of the DNA that's necessary to create a new and separate life. Unfortunately, this is often framed as an obvious scientific fact, but that, in my opinion, is not at all the case. The belief that a separate human life begins at conception, of course, leads to the conclusion that anytime a person willfully terminates any pregnancy, they're committing murder. But science is not at all that clear, because every cell in my finger has all of the necessary DNA to reproduce myself. But I would hope that no one would say that if I cut off my finger, I've committed murder, because I've killed some cells. So it's much more complicated than to say that it now has all the genetic material. Another factor that a lot of people don't know is that the medical community defines a pregnancy as beginning about 2 weeks before the egg is fertilized. I know that's really weird. I guess probably most women know this, but most men may not know this. That's because the medical community considers the beginning of a pregnancy based on when the woman's last cycle was, which is typically 12 days or so before the egg is fertilized. So when you read reports about how many weeks into the pregnancy an abortion is taking place, remember that the first 2 weeks don't count. Secondly, even the scientific medical community recognizes different stages of development before birth. So the fertilized egg is called a zygote. During the first 2 weeks after the egg is fertilized, 4 weeks of pregnancy, that is, according to medicine, the cells divide into a little blob of cells that is unromantically called a blastocyte. From the 4th week of pregnancy to the 10th week, that's 8 weeks since conception, the cluster of cells is called an embryo. And after that 8 weeks since conception, or the 10th week, according to medical science, right, it is then called a fetus, right? So there's different stages of development of pregnancy, even in the scientific community. The so-called heartbeat that's referred to in the Texas law is not really a heartbeat at all. It is a tube of cells, not at all in the shape of a heart, but the tube emits an electric pulse that can be picked up by medical instruments. And only in the last, couple of decades have we been able to do that. This occurs at 6 to 7 weeks of pregnancy, which is really 4 to 5 weeks since conception. And just so you get an idea, the embryo at this stage is about 9 millimeters long, which is 1 centimeter, about this big. That's how big we're talking about when the Texas law says we're now going to protect this as a separate human life. At this stage, as many people have commented already, some women may have just begun to realize that they're pregnant for a variety of reasons, which we don't need to go into right now. So at what stage does a developing human being become a separate human life? I don't think science can answer this question. I firmly believe this is ultimately a question of moral, ethical, and religious questions. So with all of that in mind, now I'm going to share a screen and we'll take a look at some sources that are, is it in the chat box now, the link to it? Okay, so I'm going to share a screen. Whoops, how come I can't show? I was sharing screen a moment ago. Let's see, there we go. Okay, boom. Okay, so here are the sources. So, first of all, there's a couple of biblical sources, and the most important one is this one from Exodus chapter 21. I'm surprised that most fundamentalist Christians don't know about these verses, or perhaps they interpret them very differently than what seems to be the plain meaning of them. So it's a really, really weird case, but the Torah is often filled with very strange and unusual cases. By the way, much of these legal sources in the Jewish tradition are, dealing with science and medicine of thousands of years ago and society situations that don't exist anymore. But nevertheless, they do indicate how Jewish law understands the significance of a pregnancy. So here you are, Exodus chapter 21. Two men are fighting. One of them pushes a pregnant woman and she miscarries, right? And accidentally, right? They're not intending to hurt her at all. They're just fighting with each other. She's a bystander. She accidentally gets shoved and she miscarries as a result. And then the text says, no other damage ensues. The one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him. Of course, it was a patriarchal world back then. The payment to be based on reckoning, right? So the penalty for terminating the pregnancy is a monetary fine. He pays money. But the text says, if other damage ensues, and nearly every Jewish commentator interprets this in what I understand to be the plain sense of the meaning, damage ensues, i.e. to the mother, right? We already talked about what happened to the pregnancy. Now we're talking about to the mother's body itself, right? What happened to the mother? So if any damage happens to the mother, then the penalty is the typical, what you see in the Bible, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, right? So then he has to compensate the woman for the damage that's done to her. And if she is killed, he is liable for manslaughter, right? Even though he did it accidentally, he took a human life. Later rabbinic sources, by the way, interpret eye for eye, tooth for tooth to mean also paying money damages, right? So you compensate the woman for the lost eye, you compensate her for lost hand, tooth, foot, whatever happens to her. He has to pay her damages, pay for her medical expenses. If she's working and she can't work while she's healing, she has to pay for lost time worked, etc. So, and pain and suffering. So all those things he has to pay to the woman if he hurts her. But if it's just terminating the pregnancy, it's a monetary fine he pays. Okay, everybody's clear on that part so far? One other text from the Bible, which I think is significant, it's sort of indirectly referred to, so I'm putting it in here first since it's a biblical source, comes way back in Genesis 2, when God creates Adam. Right? So the Lord God formed man, that is Adam, from the dust of the earth, Adamah, it's kind of a Hebrew pun, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So life for Adam began when he took his first breath. That's what Genesis says. Now, I saw a fundamentalist say, well, that doesn't prove anything because he clearly wasn't born as a newborn baby. He was formed as a adult or at least a teenager or something. Wasn't born as a baby. So that doesn't indicate when human life would really begin for other people. But it does play in Jewish commentary on this. So that's why I bring it in here. The breath of life comes into him and he becomes a living being. Okay, so in years gone by, there was a lot of discussion about what's called partial birth abortions. And oddly enough, there's actually a rabbinic text that seems to talk about something very much like that. It comes from the Mishnah, which is a rabbinic source interpreting Jewish law. A Mishnah was finished around the year 200. I'm not going to explain the context of it, but just read what it says over here. The Mishnah says, if a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and they bring it forth limb by limb because her life comes before the life of the unborn child. But if the greater part of the child has come out, and there's a lot of discussion about what that means, usually the head and most of the body, something like that, one may not touch it. You can't then terminate the child because one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. So it seems that the Mishnah is telling us that the point at which a pregnancy becomes a separate human life is actually at birth, in the birth process. That's when a separate human life begins and not before. Right? And that's why we say if there's any choice between the pregnancy and the mother, you obviously choose the life of the mother. She's a human being. The pregnancy is not yet a separate human being. Another source, this is from the Talmud, which is sort of a commentary on the Mishnah, completely different tractate, completely different subject matter, kind of a complicated context for this rule to come out, but it's not important for our purposes what the context is. Rav Chisda rules that until 40 days, she is not, if she's not pregnant, then she's not pregnant. But if she is pregnant until 40 days from conception, not 40 days plus 2 weeks, the way modern science would say, but 40 days since you have a fertilized egg, the pregnancy is considered merely water. It's not even considered a potential human life. It's just water. And if the pregnancy is terminated, nothing happens. The context of it, I guess, for those who might be interested, is so it's a case of a daughter of a priest. Priests are the only ones allowed to eat the sacrificial portions of sacrifices. After they're roasted, a portion is given to the priests, and it's considered holy, and only priests can eat it. But priests and their families, so the daughter of a priest could eat it. But this is a weird case again, okay? The daughter of the priest marries a non-priest, and the same day she marries him, he dies. And now the question is, can she still eat the priestly food? Right? Once she's married to this other guy, she's no longer part of the priestly family. She's part of this non-priestly family, so she wouldn't be able to eat the food. But he died on the same day. So now the question is, can she go back to eating the priestly food again? I told you it's a weird case. But anyway, so the answer is yeah, and she can continue to eat for 40 days because unless she became pregnant with this guy's baby, right, in that one day that he was alive, then she'd have to leave the priestly family. But if she's not pregnant, she gets to keep eating the priestly food. And for the first 40 days, it doesn't matter because it's like there wasn't a pregnancy. Okay, now I explained I told you they're kind of arcane. But so this is a comment. This note here is a comment. By the way, the hyperlinks here, this note hyperlink goes to the article written by Rabbi Danya Rutenberg. And she wrote a compendium of Jewish sources dealing with abortion. So if you click that note, you'll go to her sources. And she also included some of her commentary. So her commentary on the source is, it may be worth noting that modern decisors of Jewish law count the 40 days as beginning from conception. And as we said, the medical practice adds 2 weeks to that. So that would make it about 7 or 8 weeks into the pregnancy, the way medical doctors count pregnancy. And the new Texas abortion law would essentially prohibit abortions from 6 weeks, right? So at a point in time when Jewish law considers the pregnancy mere water for at least 2 more weeks, Texas law is already absolutely prohibiting the abortion. Okay, the next source is, by the way, after this next source, we'll take a break and I can take some questions. So this is from a different tractate of the Talmud altogether. It's Gittin 23b. It's, again, a bizarre context. I won't go into the context of this in this case. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who is the head of the Sanhedrin in the year 200 when the Mishnah is being edited, he is often considered the main editor of the Mishnah, a man of rabbi of great importance in Talmudic times. So not a lightweight. Yehuda Nasi says that a fetus is considered as if it's the mother's thigh. That is, the fetus is considered a part of the mother's body. Okay? And then Danya Rutenberg gives a little commentary on that. But let me pause over here. They add one more thought to that. So you might say, therefore, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who is, after all, a major authority in rabbinic literature, would seem to agree with the far left position, let's call it left, of the pro-choice movement, that it's all about the woman's body, and so therefore it's her choice. However, Jewish law adds an extra wrinkle to that, because I told you about my finger, cutting off my finger. It's not considered murder, but I'm not allowed to do it in Jewish law. I'm not allowed to hurt my own body unless I have a valid reason for hurting it, right? So if there's gangrene, obviously, I cut off whatever I need to save my life, to preserve my health. But if I don't have a valid reason for hurting myself, I'm not allowed to hurt myself, because it's not my body. It's God's body, and I'm a life tenant. So even though it's part of the mother's body, that doesn't necessarily mean she can just decide, in Jewish tradition, a woman could decide, well, I just want to terminate this pregnancy because I don't want it. I don't know too many women who do that. I mean, I don't know any women who do that. I'm sure there are cases of that, but she can't just decide, this is my form of birth control, I'm going to have an abortion. There has to be a valid reason for her to want to terminate the pregnancy, even though it's part of her body. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. We're going to look at some later sources in Jewish tradition in a moment, but if anybody has any questions so far, any questions? I can't see.
Steve, just to clarify, one of the reasons a pregnancy is calculated from the last menstrual period, number one, because the understanding of pregnancy, that a woman was pregnant, predated our knowledge of how a woman conceived. It's been known since ancient times that a woman missed her moon cycle, her menstrual cycle, and was therefore pregnant. The emerging scientific knowledge came about partially during the Victorian era to understand the whole process of conception. And it was never acceptable to ask the woman, when did you have sex with your husband? But you could always ask her about when was your last menstrual period. And customs die hard, be they Jewish customs or other customs. And therefore, you are absolutely correct. The actual conception for most women, and it can vary depending upon the length of their cycle. That's why the rhythm method is not a perfect contraceptive method, because some women ovulate early or some women ovulate late. But generally, a woman will ovulate and therefore be susceptible to fertilization about 2 weeks after the beginning of her last menstrual period. So we always talked about, with pregnant patients, weeks since their last period, because it was a for sure calculation. And even those that had uncertain menstrual periods or in vitro fertilization, when an exact date of conception was known, we would artificially calculate the last menstrual period and put that down as the dating for her period. But wow. But you're absolutely right. It seems to be confusing, when you talk weeks of pregnancy, but we're really almost always talking weeks since the last period, with the full understanding that the conception actually happened 2 weeks later. Right. But without it getting into the discussion, do we start the pregnancy then? Because that's when life begins. That's, as you've right. indicated so eloquently, that's a much separate discussion.
Right. Okay. So now let's take a look. Let's take a look at what Maimonides has to say. So Maimonides is a 12th century Jewish scholar of Jewish law, and a doctor as well. And he interprets the Mishnah in Oholot that talked about cutting up the baby even at the just before the moments before the birth, if it's to save the mother's life. And he says the reason that you are allowed to do that is because the fetus is considered a rodef. And that is a concept in Jewish law called a pursuer, someone who is seeking to kill another person. And the law of rodef is that if you see somebody pursuing somebody else to kill them, you are allowed to stop the pursuer by any means necessary, including lethal force. So the way you stop the fetus from killing the mother is you kill the fetus because it's a rodef. That was Maimonides' view. However, as a result of that, people who followed Maimonides sometimes decided that that meant that the only time you could terminate the pregnancy is when there was an actual threat to the mother's life. It was considered a rodef. But if it's short of a rodef, you don't get to do that. So I think that was an unfortunate choice of terms by Rambam. But anyway, who am I? Everybody else understands Rambam to be very limiting as to when you're allowed to terminate a pregnancy. And here he is in Hilchot Rotzeach, which is the laws of murder. This is a negative commandment. One must not take pity on the life of a rodef or pursuer. Therefore, the sages taught if a pregnant woman's labor becomes life-threatening, it's permitted to dismember the fetus in her womb, either by medication or by hand, for it's like a rodef who is pursuing her to kill her. But from the moment his head emerges, he is not to be touched, for one life is not to be set aside for another, for this is the natural course of things. Right? So that's Rambam's view. And so that was one perspective. He's basing that on a different passage in the Talmud, which is from Sanhedrin 72b, a discussion of a minor. So this is a case of a rodef, the pursuer, but like a 10-year-old boy who's pursuing an adult to kill them. Right? And for some reason, you have to kill him in order to stop him from killing the adult. Not sure why you'd have to do that with a 10-year-old boy, particularly before there were guns, but whatever. There's a 10-year-old boy pursuing an adult to kill him. And you can stop the minor, even killing him if necessary, even though the minor is not ordinarily liable for violations of law, right? Normally, we don't hold minors liable for violations of law, but in the case of murder or attempted murder, we stop them even if we have to kill them. Rav Chisda then objects to that idea and says, wait a minute, what about the just-born baby who is not killed to save the mother's life? Why then can we kill a minor, right? So once the baby is halfway out of the womb, according to the Mishnah, you can't kill the baby anymore, right? And it's only an infant. It doesn't even know what it's doing. It has no volition at all, and yet you can't kill it. So how are you allowed to kill a 10-year-old? That's his question. And the answer they give, as we'll see in a moment, is because the just-born baby is not acting out of any kind of volition, and therefore she's not being pursued by the baby per se, but they consider it pursued by heaven, right? That sort of out of the baby's hands, she's and we can't choose. So here's the text itself. Rav Chisda objected, Rav Huna, if its head emerged, it's not to be harmed. But why? If it's a rodef, then it is. If it is a pursuer, right? You should be able to kill the baby even after it's being born. But they say there it's different because he's pursued from heaven. So that's the basis on which Maimonides made his ruling. However, Rashi, commenting on that very passage in 72b of the Sanhedrin, Rashi did a commentary on the entire Talmud. Rashi is a preeminent interpreter of the Talmud, the first one, 12th century from France. And he says, if its head emerged, this concerns a woman whose labor proves so difficult as to threaten her life. The midwife should reach and dismember and remove it limb by limb, for as long as it has not emerged into the air of the world, it is not a nephesh, right? And here is, I think, this hint that Rashi is getting at that idea of Adam having the breath of life forced into him, right? So Rashi seems to be picking up on that idea about when does a separate human life begin. It's when the baby takes its breath, a breath of life. That's when it becomes a nephesh. That was the word used in Adam's case. He became a nephesh. So one is allowed to destroy it in order to save its mother. But if its head has emerged, it's not harmed, for at that point it is considered born, and one nephesh is not to be put aside for another. Here, he doesn't actually talk about rodef per se. And so even though he mentions threatening the life of the mother, again, I didn't make this up. This is the way later Jewish legal authorities interpreted Rashi. They interpreted his opinion much more liberally than Maimonides. And so you've had two different schools of thought, one of them which restricts pretty much the permissibility of abortion to saving the mother's life, and the other extending it to many other categories, including the mother's physical or mental health. And Steinsaltz, just to point this out, in his commentary on the Talmud and this very passage in Sanhedrin, says, before the baby is born, it is not considered a living soul. It is therefore not subject to the halachot of murder. The biblical passage about a woman who was caused to miscarry also indicates that abortion is not treated as murder. And he cites here another huge authority in Jewish law, the Ramah, which is Rav Moshe Isserles, a major halachic authority, Jewish legal authority in Poland for Ashkenazic Jews, right? So clearly we are at odds with the fundamentalist Christians who say that it's considered a human being at conception. The large majority of Jewish authorities say, no, it's not a human being until birth.
21.
Okay, so before we get to the conservative movement's opinions, any questions so far? Okay. So let's take a look at the conservative movement opinions. So you can find those at this link. I believe this is open to the public. I mean, I have access as a member of the Rabbinical Assembly to stuff that's not available to the public, but I think this is available to the public from this this link. You'll get all the response of our movement on the subject. However, there was a summary, sort of a source sheet produced by the Rabbinical Assembly on Jewish law and abortions, and that does not seem to be available on the website anymore, but I'm going to use excerpts from that in this, and I downloaded it before it disappeared. So I'm going to use excerpts from that to sort of highlight some of the opinions of our movement. So this is from the Cass Abelson, somewhere between 1980 and 1985. We collected opinions of our movement. Cass Abelson was the chair of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. That is the major committee that makes decisions of Jewish law for our movement in cases that are difficult and require our experts to look at the matter. So he was the chair of that committee, and this is what he wrote. It's kind of just a quotation from his lengthy article. There is clear precedent in the tradition to permit abortion of a fetus to save a mother's life and to safeguard her health, or even for a very thin reason, what he calls a thin reason, what was described in other sources as a thin reason, such as to spare her physical pain or mental anguish. Some also consider the well-being of other children and the future of the fetus itself as reasons to permit abortion. All agree that there must be a reason to justify the destruction of the potential person the fetus will become after birth. Yeah, I forgot to mention that also. Not only is it considered a part of the woman's body, but we can't destroy our own bodies, but it also has value as a potential human life, even if it's not a full human life. So in Jewish tradition, we do value that potential human life and need to weigh that against the mother's physical or emotional distress, or certainly if her life is threatened. Where there's reason to believe that the fetus might be defective, if the tests indicate the child will be born with major defects, it is permitted to abort the fetus. Now, what is a major defect? That's another subject, and I'll wait till we get all the sources out before if you want to ask questions about that. Rabbi Benzi Boxer and Cass Abelson. So Cass Abelson, the chair of the committee, Benzi Boxer was also a major rabbinic mind in our movement back then. They said together they wrote an opinion that said Jewish tradition does not permit abortion on demand. However, it sanctions abortion, that is, permits abortion under certain circumstances. The Rabbinical Assembly Committee on Jewish Law and Standards takes the view that an abortion is justifiable if a continuation of pregnancy might cause the mother severe physical or psychological harm, or when the fetus is judged by competent medical opinion as severely defective. And I want to get in one other source here from our movement. This is a more recent opinion from Susan Grossman, also a rabbi in our movement and also who sits on the law committee. Her opinion dealt with what's called partial birth abortions. She argued, and actually Dr. Gottesman may want to comment on this and we have some time. She argues that although Avi Reisner, who is a doctor as well as a rabbi and on the law committee, really said partial birth abortions should not be used except in cases where the mother's life is threatened. She argues for a variety of reasons that if her health is going to be severely problematic, Reisner didn't say you shouldn't do the abortion. He just said don't do it that way because, in his opinion, that already gets to what the Mishnah was calling partially born already, and then it's a separate life. So, but that was his understanding of what partially born meant. And Susan Grossman says that's not the only way to interpret that Mishnah. And that, here's where Dr. Gottesman can comment, that unfortunately, unless you have a expert doctor with sophisticated medical equipment in a hospital, in most cases, a partial birth abortion is the safest for the woman, as opposed to some of the other kind of these very late term abortion techniques. Does that make sense to you, Dr. Gottesman?
It makes sense, but it's not necessarily correct. And unfortunately, I've had patients who have carried a variety of genetic abnormalities. And until about 10, 12 years ago, we did not have what's called non-invasive prenatal testing, where you can begin to suspect chromosomal abnormalities as early as 12 weeks. We used to first do an amniocentesis between 15 to 16 weeks, not sooner. Amniocentesis is when you draw fluid off the amniotic sac. You didn't want to do the procedure sooner, because then the sac was small, the volume of fluid was smaller, and the chance of injuring the baby when you put a needle into the sac was higher. So 15, 16 weeks gave a decent amount of fluid, a good amount of safety to the procedure, which still carried about a 0.5% loss, a pregnancy loss to it. And then it took about 2 weeks to get the results of the chromosomes back. Now, this was routine.
I think what you're arguing, though, is that there's very few cases where you would have to wait till the end of the pregnancy to terminate it, right?
That is correct. Now, again, I think when we talked prior to this, I indicated that I had a patient who had a child that was already at that point 4 or 5 years old and severely growth restricted, was not walking, was not talking, was moving into blindness. And they actually, the best experts in Houston and around the country couldn't figure it out. And finally, they were able to elucidate a new enzyme deficiency. Most people know newborn babies get a screen at 2-3 days of life for PKU, phenylketonuria, Tay-Sachs babies are, unfortunately, they don't carry the hexosaminidase A enzyme to break down the normal waste material for metabolism in the brain, and those babies progressively get worse. This was a new defect, and they not only did they identify what the enzyme was, they were able to elucidate a test. The mom was at that point about 22 weeks pregnant. We did an amnio on her. It took 2 weeks to get the test back, and it confirmed that her child carried the same enzymatic defect, which was clear was going to result in eventual death for the child. The child that she did have already, I think, died at about 7 years of age, but wheelchair bound, uncommunicative, blind, deaf, all the bad things we don't even think about, let alone articulate.
Right, so here she is in a late-term pregnancy.
We induced her labor, and it's been known for a long time that you can do a reverse amniocentesis and still a variety of medications into the uterine sac, which will cause a labor to begin. It may take, the issue is it may take time. And I was in the hospital with her for 36 hours until she finally birthed this baby. If the baby's a little further along, and again, it's for good reason or jeopardy to the mother's health, you also have to inject something into the uterus to stop the baby's heartbeat, because it's harder to induce a labor preterm on a viable fetus. And I wonder about many of the partial birth abortions, why they're done in that fashion, other than they're quicker. You don't have to spend 12, 18, 24, 36 hours. For the mom, it's also over and done. And this is pretty hard on the mom to go through a labor. Obviously, she got an epidural early on because she was not interested in having a natural delivery for a baby that was not going to be viable. So these are some of the emotional argument is so high on both sides that some of these questions don't really get discussed. Do we really need to do partial birth abortion? Aren't there other methods to bring an end to a pregnancy that is potentially
Right.
injurious to the mom or non-viable? So
Well,
in a nutshell, I'm not a fan of partial birth abortion if there was an alternative.
okay, so we would agree with Rabbi Reisner, who's also an MD. You can read Susan Grossman's article. I reference it here if you want to get the whole thing. I didn't actually want to talk about that particular procedure. I just wanted to highlight a couple of paragraphs where she talks about the sort of the gut-wrenching realities of these things, and to kind of elucidate what those are. So here's what she says. Abortion is a serious matter, not to be entered into lightly out of respect for the potential for life vested in the fetus. In addition, when faced with tragic information about fetal deformities, prospective parents should remember that all children, regardless of any disabilities, are children of God. Right? So this is the question of how severe a defect are we talking about? So you have to weigh that against all children are children of God, equally deserving of dignity, love, and care as precious human beings. There have been many advances in our ability to treat various childhood illnesses and disabilities. In addition, education and information sharing have stimulated an increase of support in the Jewish and larger communities for families grappling with the implications of caring for children facing developmental challenges or serious childhood illnesses. Such news may encourage families facing the tragic news of fetal abnormalities to proceed with bringing the pregnancy to term. Nevertheless, not every woman or family is emotionally or physically capable of coping with the knowledge of having a disabled or terminally ill child. Sufficient precedents in Jewish law exist to permit the abortion of a severely deformed fetus, even in the latest stages of pregnancy. So, again, she's talking about, while we're weighing some very difficult choices here, and of course, every life has infinite meaning, including, all of us have some issues that we deal with in life. Some have more issues than others, but every life is valuable. And but on the other hand, if there's severe problems and the woman or her family are not capable of emotionally or physically coping with those problems, unless you can convince somebody to adopt the baby for her and take on those problems. I mean, I don't know. We're telling this family they have to deal with those problems anyway, even if they are not in a position to be able to handle them. So it's not an easy choice. She goes on to say, similarly, while Jewish law does not condone abortion as a form of birth control, abortion is permitted to protect the physical and mental health and well-being of the mother. Jewish law, as it developed, reflects a tightening of justification for abortion. That is a greater hesitancy to permit abortion without significant cause as the pregnancy proceeds from conception into the last trimester. However, sufficient precedents exist to permit abortion when there is a serious risk to the health of the mother or in the face of severe fetal abnormalities, even in the last stages of pregnancy. Serious health risk need not be immediately life-threatening, anything which would cause long-term damage to the woman or risk, and I cut it off there, but you get the idea. So before we open it up to general discussion, so I've given you what our movement says about it. We tend to be fairly liberal, and of course the Reform movement is also liberal. But I wanted to say the Orthodox world is not monolithic, and some famous authoritative rabbis would seem to agree with our general approach. One of them is Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was an eminent Orthodox authority on medicine and Jewish law in Israel in the 20th century, 1915 to 2006. And he responded to questions posed to him about a variety of matters, and the answers to those questions he collected in a book called Tzitz Eliezer. It's kind of a clever name for his book. And if you wanted to look it up, that's how you would look it up in the Tzitz Eliezer, what his opinion was. But it's fairly liberal, I would say. Much earlier, 18th century rabbi in Germany, Rabbi Jacob Emden, also seemed to be fairly liberal on this subject. But of course, there are other opinions, including the opinion of the most highly respected Orthodox authority in the United States, Moshe Feinstein of the 20th century, who seemed to forbid abortions except to save the mother's life, pretty much. I mean, very few other exceptions. He was very strict. Um, but in this matter, I highly recommend this article in the foreword, which was from 2018, called "My Dark Secret: Orthodox Women Reveal Their Abortion Stories," where they tell you their heart-wrenching stories. And the article says what's well known in the Orthodox world. You're not supposed to go to an Orthodox rabbi and ask his opinion, and then if you don't like the answer, go to a different rabbi. However, it's well known in the Orthodox world which rabbis will give you a lenient opinion and which rabbis will give you a stricter opinion. And women who find themselves in these difficult situations will go to someone who will direct them to a rabbi who will give them an answer. And even it's suggested that some rabbis who would ordinarily be strict would tell the woman, you don't want me to answer this question? Go to this other rabbi and ask him. So there are ways of dealing with these problems, even in the more strict Orthodox world, that at least give women a larger scope of flexibility. Finally, I just want to quote Rabbi Wikipedia. You can go to the article, Israel permits abortions in most cases. There's now a committee which is supposed to decide whether abortions are acceptable or not in given cases, but according to the article, nearly every case is accepted. However, Israel also has not one of the fewest per capita cases of abortion. And my guess is that's because they have health care for everybody. And so it's readily available to, abortion is a problem mostly for poor people in this country, right? That was the case in the Dirty Dancing movie, right? It was not a rich woman who got an abortion in a back alley. The wealthy women found doctors who could do it for them, even when it was prohibited. It happens really mostly for poor people who don't have medical care. And in today's day and age, if they don't get medical care and good advice about contraception, they're much more likely to end up with pregnancies that they didn't really want. And they're much more likely to carry them farther to term because they won't get medical advice until later in the pregnancy when it's unavoidable, right? Whereas if they had medical care from early on, they would be able to deal with most of these matters much earlier in the pregnancy, or maybe even avoid them with proper contraceptive techniques. So for those people who want to reduce the number of abortions in this country without putting women in really challenging situations, my recommendation would be to provide better medical care to people so that they can get that kind of treatment. The bottom line is this, and then I'll open up to questions. The question about when human life begins is not scientific. It's a matter of moral or ethical treatises, and in our case, religious determinations. And religions have very different opinions on that subject. And so when the government comes in with a position that puts the thumb on the scale down for one particular religious view, it seems to me not only interferes with the woman's right to determine what should happen, but also with her religious, the people she trusts religiously to give her guidance about what should be done. And so I would say that to the extent possible, the government should leave this up to women in consultation with whoever they consider is important in their life, hopefully including their doctors and others, and not put the thumb on the scale for the government to interfere. But I'm open to opinions of other kinds, right? So what do people think?
Okay, I'll open it. Let me throw this out. I finished my residency in OB-GYN in 1982. At that point in time, if a woman came into the hospital, and let's say she was in premature labor, and we did not have as many medications and as many tools to stop premature labor then as we did now, or if a woman's amniotic sac had broken, premature rupture of membranes. If she was below 28 weeks, and it was clear that labor was not going to be able to be stopped, not only do we let labor progress, but we sped it along with Pitocin because we knew that the outcome would be a fetus that would not survive. The ability of the neonatal practitioners to have medications, respirators, endotracheal tubes that can be sized down even to the smallest infants has progressed. And now routinely we expect 28 babies that are born at 28 weeks to survive in most cases. Really, most babies that are born at 25 weeks will survive. But then the question begins to be, are they going to be neurologically intact? And that's both an ethical and an emotional and a monetary debate. How much resources do we pull out of the stock? Because it's very expensive. It's estimated that a day in the neonatal intensive care unit is probably $10,000 a day. Do we pull out all stops for a baby at 25 weeks and 1 day where its chance of being neurologically intact, functioning as a normal human being that doesn't need around the clock help, maybe, and I'm giving you statistics from when I stopped OB 6 years ago, may only be 10%. At 25 weeks and 6 days, it may be up to 30%. And then it was a thorny situation for us when we had parents who mom was in labor at 24 weeks and long history of infertility, and this was an IVF baby, and she said, please do everything you can to save my baby, even though the neonatologist said we probably won't be able to do anything. But it seems to me that the debate should not be about, when do we permit abortions? The debate really needs to be about when shouldn't we permit abortion? Because if a woman is at eight months and 3 weeks pregnant and you induce an abortion, and that has to really be a late term. It has to be to turn the baby to breech, deliver it, feed an abdomen, and then put a needle or a large bore device into the base of the neck and basically suck out the brain material and crush the brain. And I'm saying this, it's graphic. Like most of us don't like to think about how our kosher meat arrives in the nice packages in the grocery store. And probably if we did, many more of us would be vegetarian. But it's hard to escape all the practitioners that are involved when a woman has to have a late-term abortion.
But again, in a situation where there's not a pressing medical urgency about this, right? You can probably avoid almost all of those if the woman had medical care as soon as she discovered she was pregnant.
Yet before the current wave of Senate Bill 8 from Texas and Mississippi law, for several decades, most states began to outlaw with some, exceptions, such as a threat to the life of the mother or clear, fetus incompatible with life that was discovered late. Most, said not beyond. Some states said 24 weeks. Some states said 26 weeks. And that's because it was thought that that's where viability was going to be for the ability of the fetus to live independently outside the mother. It may need assistance. It may need assistance in the neonatal intensive
Right, but
care
again, if you want to avoid later term abortions, right, just provide medical care for women earlier so that they just get treatment.
If the argument is that, and is this true, that the majority of the over 1 million abortions a year in this country, a majority are going to be in lower income women, those same women they can go to Planned Parenthood for an abortion, can also go to Planned Parenthood for birth control and also for early terminations. There really should be very, very rare instances of late terminations in this country, but there are. And in the Soviet Union, where 1 in 3 women had an abortion because contraception, even condoms, were unavailable under communist rule, Eastern Europe has seen the greatest decline in abortions with the introduction of readily available contraception. we've been fairly steady in this country, even as more and more contraceptive methods have become available. The
I think
first,
there's an article I can post later from 2019 that said that abortions actually have been declining in recent decades, and that 90%, this is what the article said, 90% of abortions happen within the first trimester.
it's correct. And as I said, the real argument should not be abortion legal, not legal. Abortion should certainly be available, be safe. Where the sides on the polar opposites really need to start coming to grips is, when should abortion not be done? Not the right to lifers that say never, and not the my woman, my body, my choice. You have no say about what I do. In Jewish medical ethics, we have four pillars. One is autonomy, that a patient has an autonomous person. But then there's also beneficence, that what you do should be for good, non-malfeasance, which means you shouldn't do bad, which is supposed to preclude most of us from doing ridiculous investigational treatments like don't drink bleach to treat COVID. Okay, that would be beneficent. And the last pillar, at least in Jewish medical ethics, is justice. And that's the thorny issue. When does the fetus, have some rights that you don't want to violate? Everybody would agree that 5 minutes before the mom gives birth, even though the baby hasn't emerged and taken its breath, you don't want to do something, put an instrument in the uterus, do something to harm that
Right.
fetus.
So another point would be that I think we also could improve the adoption system in the country potentially, but it's assuming that every unwanted pregnancy can be adopted, which I'm not sure that there's necessarily a good matching system for that we could be assured that would happen. But of course would make it a lot easier for a woman to say, okay, I guess I can have this baby because I know it's going to have a good home. I can't take care of it, but I know it'll have a good home.
By the way, just lest anybody listening think I'm a right to lifer, I've worked for Planned Parenthood in my early years in practice. I worked in an abortion clinic in Clear Lake until it was firebombed one weekend. But I fully believe in a woman's right to choose. This is an issue of competing rights. When do the rights of a fetus that is at viability or approaching viability, when do those rights begin to conflict? And
I think that your views on this align with what the Jewish tradition says. So that's what I would advise if I was a rabbi. But on the other hand,
you are.
What?
You are a rabbi.
Yes, I are. And but on the other hand, I also recognize that this is just one religion, and some people are atheists. And right, so if for an atheist you say that the fetus is just a part of the woman's body, what is an atheist? I mean, maybe an atheist would conclude for moral reasons there still is a responsibility, but maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd say, well, it's her choice, it's her body. And I don't know, I can't say anything to that because they're not Jewish. So anyway, because the point of this is it's a very complicated situation, and it's deeply fraught with deep emotional feelings and moral values on a lot of different sides. And I think the issues have to be carefully weighed. But I personally think the best thing is for, at least in the Jewish world, for women to consult with their religious, a person who they have high regard for religiously, and potentially the father and other family members or whoever, but and have to weigh these things out and figure out what's the best situation for her given all the circumstances. And the other thing I would note is that Jewish tradition definitely puts the emphasis on the woman and her emotional and physical well-being, right? So it's for just an extreme example, a woman who has a pregnancy because of she was forced into this. Most women would probably say, I don't want to have this baby because I don't want to be reminded of this person or that incident. But some women might say, you know what, this is still a baby, and I want to have this baby, and it's still my baby, and I still want to have a life. I mean, I could imagine that could happen. And so again, if that's the case, Jewish law says fine, then she should have the baby, right? Because it's her emotional well-being that matters. Okay, anyway, that's the story for this evening. I'm always willing to hear contrary opinions or whatever. You can email me or let me know any comments or suggestions. But I just wanted to lay out what the Jewish tradition generally says. And you have the source sheet. If you want to download it, you can. And take a look at the other sources that I referenced in this outline.
Steve, if I can ask, has the conservative movement taken a stance, for instance, on the hugely restrictive Texas Senate Bill 8?
Yeah, I opposed to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would think so. By the way, it seems to me that they made this absolutely strict. I mean, not even permitting to save the life of the mother or in cases of rape or incest. I think they want this to go to the Supreme Court. I know there's a Mississippi law barring abortion after 15 weeks, but they think that this is maybe another chance to do it so severe that
This
the
is the
Supreme
most
Court will
draconian.
have to rule on it and come down with something.
Yep. By the way, the that case that I mentioned of the woman who was pregnant in the car accident, right? Total strangers sued to stop the abortion, even without the Texas law and even with Roe v. Wade in place, right? So now the Texas law officially gives those total strangers the license to sue.
Yeah, it gives them standing when they should really have none.
Standing to sue, and it's just quite remarkable.
It's not clear yet if they have standing. That'll have to be determined by the court.
Well, but the Texas statute gives them standing. The court may decide the statute's unconstitutional.
Correct.
Okay.
A very interesting, timely discussion. Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi Morgen.
All right.
Rabbi,
Thank
it
you.
was
Have a
nice.
good evening, everybody.
Bye.
Okay.